Good afternoon, everyone. It's just afternoon here in Boston on Friday, coming towards the very latter part of our course. Be interesting as we do move towards the end to reflect on where we began, what kinds of issues we were looking in then. I'm going to give you some assignments for the last week to go back to some earlier lessons and to look at them a little bit now from the position you're in. I also have begun to get information on the final papers that you're working on. I would like to have something from everybody. And next week I'm going to ask you to post. There'll be a folder. There is a folder already that asks you to post what your topic is, what kinds of materials you're using, and so on. So I hope that project is making progress. That you're making progress with that project. I think you also saw probably a very welcome email from me which said that I'd reduce the number of references you need to have from 15 to 10. So I think that's probably a more reasonable amount, and you should be working towards that now. Again, the eBrary site is very useful. Rambi is useful. We do have even other things available in digital form on the library, on our own library website, and hopefully you'll be able to get to libraries wherever you might be. The assignment for this week and next week, really the last assignments, new assignments for the course, deal with Midrash. This week it was Midrash Halakhah. Next week it will be Midrash Agadah, the non-legal Midrash, and you'll receive information on that just when after I finish this video. I'll put the other material up for you to look at. I think it'll be fun. I think that those of you who had an opportunity to do some Talmud study, particularly in Chavruta with somebody else, found this, I think, to be an interesting activity, an interesting experience. And you should know that, of course, Jews do this all the time in the Hebrew. In the Orthodox world, this material is the kind of thing which people spend days, months, years, lifetimes engaging, not just about damages, but about all kinds of things. Whatever area comes up in life, from the most obscure to the most public and so on, is dealt with in Midrash Halakhah. So let me go back over a little bit about Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh, the kinds of things that you read about in Elman and Stern. Then we'll talk a little bit about your responses, the omnis significance question, and your responses to the study of the Mishnah in Bava Kama, Hachovel b'chavero chayav alav mishum chamisha dvarim. If you injure your fellow, you are responsible to him according to 5 categories. To begin with, just as a kind of overall picture of this, the concept of oral Torah is one that comes out of Pharisaic and Rabbinic Judaism. As I wrote in one of my responses, that means the concept of Torah shebichtav, written Torah, is part of the concept of oral Torah. If there is no oral Torah and all you have is Torah, all you have is Tanakh, then you don't need a concept of written Torah. Written Torah is distinguished from oral Torah. Then, if as Sean had written, the Tanakh is the Tanakh, and if there is no concept of oral Torah, there is no written Torah. It's the same concept as Halakhah and Agadah, legal and non-legal. Who makes that distinction? The rabbis make that distinction later on, and therefore, it's not that you find Halakhah in the Torah shebichtav, which you can find resources for it, you can find authority for various things that you want to do, but essentially the process of finding halakha, of finding Jewish law, is an oral Torah kind of process. And the nature of Midrash that we've been looking at this past week, Doresh, means to derive from, to pull out of, to connect to what the rabbis would say, the written Torah. The oral Torah is that which was believed to be passed down to Moshe on Mount Sinai, along with the written Torah, so that the interpretations that come down later, for example, the eye for an eye, which means monetary compensation, according to the rabbis, it's not that all of a sudden in the first century somebody decided that that's what it means. It's rather that the oral Torah, which was passed down, as it says in the Pirkei Avot and the Ethics of the Fathers, from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to the elders, and so on, all the way down to the rabbis, that this was always the case. And in the reading that you had from the Mishnah and then the Talmud, there's a case that's being made there that says we could never have done an eye for an eye. It's too messy. It's too difficult. How would you ever be able to do that? What if somebody with two eyes puts out the eye of somebody with one eye? What if when you're putting somebody's eye out, the person happens to die? That's a real possibility when you're doing that kind of thing. It doesn't really work. So they believe that this was always the case, and that Torah Shebaal Peh, that these rules were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. At the same time, there is another principle which is in tension with this idea that everything at the oral Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and that's the idea of it being oral, that it being something that's not written down. Oral, the impact of oral means that it responds to the generations in which the issues arise. We don't always know what kinds of issues are going to come up. And the oral character of it, that sense of give and take, which exists in the study of Talmud, is a way to derive from the written Torah and to derive from other parts of the oral Torah new kinds of laws. So there are principles which develop. There are the principles of Rabbi Ishmael. There's other kinds of principles which develop, which say these are the ways that we are going to develop our concept of law. Some of it has to do with the historical development of laws. What did our rabbis do? What did our parents do? What did our grandparents do? How does that relate to what we do? Other has to do with drasha, midrash. How do we derive these things from the text? But the important thing here is to say that Torah Shebaal Peh and the drasha that occurs with it is not always the peshat, P-E-S-H-A-T, which means the simple literal meaning of the text. That the meaning that is offered here might well be something which is not the literal meaning of the text, that is, which is passed, but it's passed down from generation to generation. For example, all of the laws about kashrut, about keeping kosher, are part of Torah Shebaal Peh, and they don't necessarily come directly from the literal reading of the text. So I think, as Sean was saying with regard to the Karaites, who don't necessarily accept the division between milk and meat, all the Torah says is you shouldn't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Out of that, the rabbis developed a whole distinction between and rules regarding the separation of milk and meat. Most likely at that time, there were traditions within the Jewish community of separating milk and meat. Where they came from is not entirely clear, and they got developed and integrated into the overall pattern of Jewish life. The same thing has to do with Sabbath observance. There are certain ways that Sabbath observance is described in the Torah, and there are other ways that the Sabbath observance is developed and thought about by the rabbis, which is much, much more detail-oriented, all kinds of things which we can do, which we can't do. How do you figure it out? A famous argument between Hillel and Shammai, or the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, rather, is about whether if something is started before Shabbat and continues to develop on Shabbat, if you put food into the oven before Shabbat and it continues to cook on Shabbat, are you allowed to eat it since there's work that's been done on it on Shabbat, even though you haven't done that work? Or if you take stuff into the cleaners on Friday and you pick it up on Sunday, are you allowed to have it if the work was done on Saturday by non-Jews? Or by robots or whatever it might be. And Hillel takes the position that it doesn't make any difference if you didn't do it yourself, and if it were not other Jews who were doing it, then it can continue to develop on Shabbat itself, while the house of Shammai says, no, you can't do that. If anything happens to it on Shabbat, you're not able to use it, and so on and so forth. None of these things are exactly obvious. So that kind of thing with regard to Midrash Halakhah is something that you learn in the Elman and the Stern essay. And that sense that every item, everything with regard to human life, with regard to how we are to live our life, is subject to halakha. If you fundamentally believe that God cares about everything you do, when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, how you have sex, how you don't have sex, how you go to the bathroom even. There's a prayer when you come out of the bathroom to thank God for having made the human body in the way that it is, and particularly when it's working properly. Every possible thing you can imagine, that's what halakha does. And if you believe that God cares about that, then you want to figure out the right way to do it, because there is a right way and there is a wrong way. And that's what halakha is all about, finding the right way. Now, often there's more than one right way. It doesn't have to be only one, but for the most part, they are looking for the right way. And that's the fundamental difference between Midrash Halakhah, which has to do with behavior, and what we'll be looking at this coming week, which is Midrash Haggadah, non-legal Midrash, which has to do with interpretations of stories, theology, ethics, history, all of these things. And people will discover in the biblical text all kinds of interesting moral teachings. And whatever you can discover in that text is good. And people don't argue about, you won't find the same kind of discourse with Midrash Haggadah as you do with Midrash Halakhah. I found a beautiful meaning in a passage, somebody else finds something different, which is also beautiful. So I'm very excited to see what that person has found, and he's excited to see what I found, because the view is here that text has evoked in us something that has allowed us to see something in that text. We're not creating, we're discovering it. And as the concept, as I mentioned to Ben in the office hours, of Shiv'im Panim La Torah, the 70 faces of Torah. Torah can have 70 different faces, particularly in the area of Haggadah. I also noticed that many of you had a good experience, interesting experience, studying this material with a chevruta, with someone else. This kind of stuff is intended to be that way. It is itself written in a dialogic form. You have different rabbis talking with each other. You got to figure out who says what and keeping it straight and so on. And it is a very intensive, encompassing experience. When you get involved in it, it's like really nothing else. And I recommend just playing with it a little bit so you can see the pleasure and the power that it has for people who study it. I would say the same thing is true with Midrash Haggadah in a different way, and you will get to see that this coming week. So I wish you all a good week. And if you have questions, if you have issues with regard to your paper or with regard to anything about the course, please do get in touch with me. As I say, there's only a couple more weeks left. So I'm eager to be helpful to you in the writing of this. And in making sure on your side that you don't have any questions about the strategy, about doing it, and so forth. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and we'll continue to be in touch.